We have the next panel, which is chaired by Miriam Sturkenboom, Head of Data Science and Statistics Department at Julius Center for UMCU, and our president. We have Rebecca Chandler, Senior Vaccine Safety Lead at CEPI. We have Niklas Blomberg, Executive Director of IHI, and imagine they have a big brokerage event next door, but the director is sitting with us, so we are very, very pleased. Thank you very much, Niklas. We have Charlotte Verhnes, Director of Scientific and Medical Affairs at Vaccines Europe. We have Maria Dutarte, Executive Director of EUPATI, the European Patient Academic Organization. And then we have the Laura Cornelissen, co-lead of the Bella Assistant Group and the NITAC of Belgium. And we have Jean-Michel Dogné, Prof and Dean of the Faculty of Medicine of Namur, Belgium. Thank you.
So we have a very well-established panel, as you see here, and we have had great discussions this morning, looking back on what was going well and what could be improved. And I think what we have seen is that there is a theme coming up, and that is that, yes, we can be very good in generating evidence, but that is not enough. We need to also communicate that. So this afternoon, we would like to continue with this different panel that may have different perspectives. We'll use a similar format. So first of all, they give their own perspectives, either with or without slides. It's up to their choice. And then we will have a guided discussion, and we can have also questions from the room. So first of all, I would like to ask Rebecca Chandler, just recently introduced. Rebecca has a history, a long-term history in drug safety. She is a medical doctor, but she worked at the Swedish Medicines Agency. She also worked at the Uppsala Monitoring Center. And I have the pleasure to work with her through the SPEAK project already a couple of years, because currently she is working at the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, where she really tries to give all her passion to safety and having harmonized safety monitoring. Rebecca, welcome. If you want to stand here.
I think I want to stand there.
Okay, good.
Just because I think CEPI is maybe a new, so I hope my slides are here. Yes. Thank you so much for having me. I'm enjoying myself intensively already, and I think that for opening the morning, the pre-lunch session set the bar very high. So please know I have a certain, my heart rate is a little higher, I think, than it may have been earlier if we had been first. But I want to tell you all a little bit about CEPI. And what we're doing in the space of vaccine safety and pharmacovigilance, because I don't know how many of you know so much about CEPI. It's a relatively young organization. So I want to share with you what we've been doing over the past 5 to 4 years, and maybe think about, and hopefully in the discussion, think about actually how we can partner with VAC4EU to think about moving us on into the future. So, next slide, please. So the Coalition of Preparedness Innovations was created in 2017, really in response to the West African Ebola epidemic. And from that grew a consensus that we needed a coordinated and international plan to both develop and deploy vaccines in response to public health emergencies. And so CEPI was actually launched in Davos by the governments of Norway and India, along with the funding organizations of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, as well as the World Economic Forum. And the mission of CEPI is to accelerate the development of vaccines and other biologic countermeasures against epidemic and pandemic threats so that they can be accessible to all. And in its initial strategy, what we call CEPI 1.0, it was largely driven by investments in early clinical development for vaccines against the WHO priority pathogen list. And the plan was to invest in development through phase 2 and stockpile. Next section, next slide. So, but very early on in the lifespan of CEPI happened the COVID-19 pandemic. And actually, CEPI got involved in response to the COVID pandemic in ways that were not necessarily aligned with CEPI 1.0. They found themselves increasingly involved in later stage clinical development, filling of knowledge gaps related to the vaccines that were in use. So those experiences and thinking about responses to the COVID pandemic really informed the thinking of what we call CEPI 2.0, so our second funding cycle. And so those experiences fed into the strategic goals that were outlined for CEPI 2.0, which was to be between 2022 and 2026. So here you can perhaps see that we're coming to our final year of our second funding cycle. But originating during the planning of CEPI 2.0 now a number of years ago was really the concept of a 100 days mission. And perhaps you've heard that because it's been accepted by both the G7 and the G20. And the idea is to be able to make a vaccine available for response to a new pathogen with pandemic potential within 100 days. Next slide. So the world witnessed and dramatically benefited from the game-changing COVID-19 vaccine response. And really thanks to a lot of preparedness, research on other coronaviruses, as well as innovative scientific technologies, CEPI and others were able to advance trials of multiple COVID-19 vaccines at record speed. And as you know, traditional clinical development timelines were compressed from well over 5 years, I've even heard up to 12 years, down to about 350 days. And so it was really looking at the shortest time intervals for each of the different phases of clinical development that were reached by some of the COVID-19 vaccine developers that the concept of a 100 days mission was born. And we accept that being able to respond in 100 days requires a significant paradigm shift in the way that we think about clinical development and also how we think about public health response. Next slide. So this paradigm shift really focuses on two areas. Preparedness, so spending a lot of effort during peacetime to build up networks and build up a coalition of partners that can help us prepare, but also using outbreaks and public health emergencies as they happen as a time to generate evidence, regulatory grade evidence that may support eventual licensure of vaccines. So really breaking a firewall between evidence generation for the purposes of regulatory approval during public health responses. So next slide. So what does vaccine safety and pharmacovigilance look like in a 100 days mission? So that was essentially the task that I was given when I joined CEPI now 4 years ago at the beginning of the CEPI 2.0 funding cycle. Just as a side note, CEPI did recognize very early from its original inception that vaccine safety had a very important component. And they actually partnered with the Brighton collaboration in the SPEAK project in 2019, so before my arrival. But again, lessons learned from the COVID pandemic, moving from simple investment in early clinical development for priority pathogens and really learning from the pandemic experience, they wanted a much broader and comprehensive idea of what vaccine safety and pharmacovigilance means in a 100 days mission. So me and my partner, there's work with a man called Alexander Precioso, who has previously worked at Instituto Butantan in industry, on the industry side in pharmacovigilance from Brazil. The two of us have worked over the last 4 years to build a coalition for vaccine safety and pharmacovigilance. And we started with our mission, which is to ensure the generation of robust evidence enabling timely benefit risk assessment of vaccines in the acceleration of both their development and deployment against epidemic and pandemic threats. So next slide. So what will it take to achieve what we think is safety and pharmacovigilance in 100 days. So we actually built a strategy that has 5 pillars. And so I'll go through them quickly. So creating a library of standardized safety endpoint definitions for our both CEPI priority pathogens, but also vaccine platforms that we are continuing our investments in. Number 2, establishing approaches and networks for robust safety evidence generation, specifically in LMIC, lower and middle income country settings. Number 3, investigation into biomarkers of reactogenicity and actually elucidating mechanisms and risk factors for known serious AESI. I make a special call out to VITT, TTS, and myocarditis. The reason for that being is because we continue to believe in the excellent record that both the adenoviral platform and the mRNA platform served us during COVID. So we continue development in those vaccine platforms, so to say. So we've made a commitment to really trying to understand more closely the mechanisms and risk factors for those 2 safety signals that were identified during COVID-19. Number 4, we want to integrate pharmacovigilance and risk management into the global manufacture of vaccines, again, particularly in LMIC. And number 5, accelerating processes and improving coordination in response to AESIX. So at CEPI, we talk a lot about disease X, the unanticipated pathogen that may cause a global pandemic. So we translated this into the AESIX, which I actually think is probably a bit more common than disease X, as we heard earlier, the unexpected, as Peter mentioned, with both narcolepsy and VITT. Next slide. So at CEPI, the concept is we're a funder. We don't do anything ourselves, so we build a coalition of partners. So CEPI is all about building partnerships with organizations, whether they be vaccine developers, whether they be labs, whether they be academic institutions, to help us achieve this 100 days mission. And here is just a map that I created quite a bit of time ago, which kind of overlays all the partners in our Coalition for Vaccine Safety and Pharmacovigilance, along with giving you an idea where our pandemic pathogens that we're very concerned about tend to have epidemics in those regions. Next slide. So hopefully you can see that I've given an icon to each of these pillars, and in the interest of time, I won't go into too much detail, but I want to tell you a bit about the members of our Safety and Pharmacovigilance Coalition. Several of them have actually already been mentioned today, so they'll be very familiar. But as I mentioned, of course, for our standardized case definitions, of course, we work with the Brighton collaboration in the SPEAK project. I think it's worth noting, everyone knows that the bread and butter of the Brighton collaboration are case definitions for safety outcomes. But in their project with CEPI, they've actually really expanded the scope of the support that they provide with the creation of companion guides to assist with the implementation of case definitions. They've also worked on a standardized template for benefit risk assessment for vaccines. And they've also helped us to do some training to build up the capacity and availability of researchers in lower and middle income countries to serve on data safety monitoring boards in their countries for clinical trials we're sponsoring in their countries. So next slide. Number 2, so this is the networks for evidence generation, largely in LMIC. So we have 2 projects in this space. The first is the BRAVE project. This is our partnership with the Global Vaccine Data Network. And it's really we're working with a number of sites in a number of countries. And I feel so bad I haven't updated this slide. Please know Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Rwanda, and also most recently, we've added the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have partners there. And what we're going to do is we funded them over the upcoming 3 years to generate background incidence rates of AESIs that would be relevant for vaccines that were likely to be used in their context. So for Lassa fever, for Rift Valley fever, and the like. I'm incredibly excited about this project because background incidence rates and understanding of these safety outcomes, particularly in Africa, has been just absent. So we're really going to fill a need here for a number of stakeholders in the vaccine safety ecosystem. Next slide. Also a network. This is a very recent partnership that we just announced We also have sites of clinical epidemiology sites that are actually located in countries in alignment with these vaccine manufacturers in the DCVMN, the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturing Network. So these are sites in which we will build capacity to perform active safety surveillance studies that they actually platforms that they might use to do studies for the vaccines for which they are responsible. They will be the marketing authorization holder. Next slide. Third, again, this is the biomarkers and understanding the genomics and potentially multi-omics of these adverse events of special interest. It was mentioned earlier today, the INSIS project, and I think I've given you enough information about that, but just to know, I think CEPI will be responsible for funding really the building the infrastructure for this network and this first study looking at myocarditis and TTS. And our hope is that we really can move into looking at other adverse events of special interest and that this network could be at the ready in case we have another global pandemic and another unanticipated safety concern, or even one that's anticipated that we actually don't really understand the risk factors and the like for. Really harnessing this situation of a global pandemic, that we will have been able to pool enough data on these rare outcomes to actually do such a study. Next slide. And then the fourth was building up pharmacovigilance and risk management capacity in manufacturers. This is just a nice paper that was actually authored by my partner that I mentioned earlier with his work at the DCVMN, which was really a landscaping. This was done just prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, mapping a lot of the capacities in pharmacovigilance in these DCVMN members. And unfortunately, there's not been a lot of strong legislation in lower and middle income countries for the practice of pharmacovigilance. Therefore, in some of these partners, pharmacovigilance as an industry discipline, so to say, is weak. So we're working with IQVIA and PATH actually to build up capacity for pharmacovigilance in these industry partners. So understanding the gaps that they may have, being able to provide them a library of standard operating procedures for pharmacovigilance requirements, that sort of thing. And then the final slide is actually the strengthening global vaccine safety surveillance systems and rapid responses to AESIX. So this is a little bit more my personal wish. I mean, from my experience, as I mentioned earlier, from the beginnings with narcolepsy, but how can we make our systems more robust to the rapid identification of the unknown? How can we use real-world data sources with a time lag to rapidly respond? We need a case definition, for example. So how can we put this all together to do this? Can we respond to AESIX in 100 days, might be the way I'd put it. CEPI is looking to try to respond to disease X in 100 days. So I've been working with all of our partners. I think all of our partners in our coalition play a role here, and this is kind of the task or the challenge to put before them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. And you said that the former panel put the bar very high, but I think 100 days mission is also a very high bar. So let's come back this afternoon in the discussion, like how VAC4EU could help to, and how we can be ready and have real world evidence. So I'm very happy to introduce the next speaker, who's Niklas Blomberg. And Daniel already said that he is here and escaped the brokerage event. Niklas is a scientist originally, and he came from Open Facts, where he first met IMI, I guess, the project, and then founded Elixir, also a research infrastructure. Then he moved on to AstraZeneca, where you spent time, and now you are with IHI and, being the director and giving us guidance on where to invest the money.
Thanks, Miriam. So a lot of old sins were unearthed there. So I did actually coordinate an IMI project when I worked for AstraZeneca 15 years ago. So we were probably less successful than Advance and VAC4EU because I never get to go to the 5-year anniversary of the foundation we created. But I'm really happy to be here, and it's good to see Maria as well for EUPATI, which is another really successful graduate, I think, of the IMI program. So it's a very hard act to follow Rebecca from CEPI, so I don't know what to say. So I want to say a few words about us as a funding partner. I think the idea is to be a bit of a preamble to a longer discussion here in the panels. I'll try to be quite brief. We are Europe's public-private partnership for health research. The strapline is bold collaborations transforming health, and I think that's really what we set out to do. And it's in the center of this slide. It really is to be a platform where you can fund projects that bring together organizations from across all sectors, whether it's be academic research, whether it's healthcare, where it's actually public organizations such as regulators, industry, medtech, pharma, biotech, but also importantly, we pride ourselves on bringing in a lot of civil society organizations, either patient organizations as beneficiaries, but we also do a lot of collaborations with philanthropic organizations and try to shape topics that is of common interest and take them forward. And we do this because I think our ultimate goal is to help to transform health across the entire spectrum. And so we do works in early discovery, understanding diseases, all the way up into implementation into healthcare systems or embedding into industrial processes, or indeed incorporating into regulatory decision making. And I think I'm really pleased with this slide. This is from IHI. You will be familiar with IMI, the predecessing program. But if we look here, we see the diversity of organizations that we bring into our projects. And I think we're really pleased to see, it's large companies, academic research, universities, university medical centers, a lot of SMEs, but it's also healthcare organizations, patients, civil society, public authorities, as I said, and then some others, including a lot of philanthropic organizations. So that's about us, but we were supposed to look a bit forward, so I thought I would say a few words that maybe help us think a little about that going forward. So what do we do? If you think about health research, so to make really meaningful impact, that is a problem that requires input from a lot of different stakeholders. And so how can we align all of these stakeholders along common problem and really try to drive that? And in this case, I think the question is really around preparedness and long-term societal well-being. And I honestly think that public-private partnerships, so partnerships where you really bring to bear the strength of the capabilities in industry together with the civil society and research really can be transformative. What we do is we mobilize investments, which is really important. I think Seppi gave a good example of how important it is to mobilize investments from a large number of different actors and align in this space. But it's also about mobilizing the innovation capabilities industry. So many of the large companies, but also SMEs, of course, have very innovative and strong, say, engineering platforms or abilities to take innovations through a regulatory approval chain. And there is no reason why you can't build on that to deliver innovations for the whole society. I think what we also like to think that we help to connect the European life science hubs. So, Europe has a very strong science base. The question is, how do you connect it so that you can actually leverage and really drive competitiveness and societal well-being long-term in Sweden, or in Europe, sorry for So, and then just to wrap this up, so where do I see opportunities? So last year everyone talks about the Draghi report. It was actually a similar report produced by the Finnish former President Sauli Niinistö on the European preparedness. And so what do we need to build for resilient societies in Europe and partnership with the rest of the world? So one of the areas we were very pleased to be mentioned, but actually one of the solutions they pointed to as a commission was to leverage the potential of public-private cooperation. And the point they were really making was that there are a lot of private sector capabilities that can be aligned around important societal goals. And if we think in that space, so where do we need to work? Well, I think there are three areas. So first is, as I said, Europe has a very, very strong research base. The question is, how do you connect that into innovation capabilities? You move from strong research to an innovation that actually make a difference to people. If we look in our program, we've seen work in tuberculosis on drug combinations, and some of them have moved forward very long. Platforms, and I think one of the, it can be in vaccines, there's been work on some platforms, there's been work on AI-driven discovery. I think one of the areas that was funded in the past with IMI, I think it's dropped down, but I think is a really important area of unmet need is point-of-care diagnostics. So do we have the capabilities not only for vaccines, but actually for the diagnostics that underpin the campaigns? And I think that might be a really important innovation area. But it's not only about the innovation, it's also the innovation enablers. And I think VAC4EU is one of them. It's the data networks. So how do we actually create and maintain the European data networks? Not for the sense of networks, but actually as the foundation for evidence generation. We have a similar issue in clinical trials. We've funded a number of clinical trial networks, pediatrics and so on, and we need to keep them sort of ever warm to be able to ramp up trials. And then I think manufacturing capabilities, we've seen that the geopolitics are changing, and so Europe needs to also have the capabilities to manufacture the drugs and the vaccines and the medical countermeasures that we actually need. But then I think the third area is really to build that ecosystem, to link together research, innovation, the innovation enablers, but also with the public and the healthcare systems. Today, I think we'll talk a lot about real-world evidence, and so we talked about it over lunch. How do you bring the sort of evidence network into a point where it actually matters for decision-making and link it to actual decision-making? I think that's a really key area, and it goes beyond the research project. Similar arguments can be made around platform trial infrastructure. So how do you keep the platform trials? In IHI, we now have a whole series of projects around care beyond the hospital walls. So looking at the healthcare transformation. Well, actually, if you want to be long-term successful, you need to work with the national healthcare systems to drive that type of innovation. So I think these are three important areas for the future. And just one final slide on the partnerships and why they're important. I think one other thing of these partnerships is that they really work as neutral brokers. And if we think about European health data innovation, I think that might be the thing that sets Europe apart. In many other geographies, health data is a commodity. It's either controlled, bought and sold as a sort of product. The US have a very active market. If you want real-world data, you just go and buy it in the US from the insurance companies. In other parts of the world, it's a collateral for reduced cost of healthcare. A number of Asian countries, you donate your data and then the hospitals will lower the upfront cash costs for treatment. I think Europe probably would want to go in a different direction, and of course in China it's a state entity. I think Europe want to go in a different direction. I think we want to have openness. I think we really want to deal with our health data on the basis of legitimacy, i.e. who is the legitimate user, who is the legitimate owner, who is the legitimate handler of the data. You want to work on it on the basis of trust. Can you actually trust the drivers and the decisions that are taken from that data? And I think that it's different from legitimacy. And then I think the third component there is really how do we bring innovation into the system? Innovation in terms of regulatory decision-making, but also in terms of product development and academic research. And I think the way forward here really is to create this partnership with civil society, with industry, and with research to link legitimacy, trust, and innovation. So a couple of good examples. VAC4EU is one. Of course, the whole Darwin EU network. I see Peter here in the audience. I think that's probably a world-leading example of how you really drive regulatory-grade decision-making from what was quite an open network, and it's based on open standards, open innovation. You have broad participation, and I think it's important to have that broad participation from public, patient, civil society to success. And actually, I think the other thing that came out of this project is the European ecosystems. There are a lot of SMEs in this space. And actually, done right, we can help to build a lasting European ecosystem for data, which I think is important. It's a lot of jobs and it's a lot of innovation there. So I'll finish there. So thank you very much for the ability to come here and congratulate you on your 5 years anniversary. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Niklas, for your perspective. And we are grateful for the initial funding provided by IMI, which actually made all of this possible. So I would like to continue and give the word to Charlotte Verhnes from the Vaccines Europe organization, and she will give her perspective as a talking point for the industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to see if I think I have slides. Yes, great. So it's really lovely to be part of this discussion. Thank you for the invitation. I think a lot of you in the room with whom I've interacted know I'm a strong believer in public-private partnerships. I also have a IMI history since I led 2 IMI projects on RSV, Rescue and Promise, and I know some of you from that time. So great to be here today. So first, a brief introduction about Vaccines Europe. So Vaccines Europe is the specialized vaccine group of FPA, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. And Vaccines Europe represents 16 members, 16 vaccine companies who are either global but operate in Europe, or small and medium enterprises based in Europe, innovating in Europe. And I've seen in the room representatives from HIPRA, from GSK, from J&J, who are all members. So our members really innovate on vaccines, and our mission at Vaccines Europe is to foster this innovation, but also the value recognition of life course immunization in Europe to protect populations against evolving threats. So we raise awareness about the value of vaccine, the innovation taking place, and the contribution of the industry in all this. And one way that we do this, and I thought I would start with this because we're talking about looking forward, is every year we run an annual update of our Vaccines Europe pipeline review, which looks at all vaccines and prophylactic monoclonal antibodies against infectious diseases that are in development by our 16 member companies. So we look at phase 1, 2, and 3. And this allows us to capture trends in vaccine innovation, to also serves as a horizon scanning resource for our stakeholders. I had conversation actually, I think a year ago, with some people from VAC4EU who said that they look at it as well to know what's coming down the pipe and what will be coming on the market next and where there will be studies needed. So the 2024 review is currently available and was capturing data collected until end of August 2024. I'm happy to announce also that on December 1st, we'll publish the 2025 edition. So as you can imagine, we're in the finishing stages of review right now. And so just a few insights from the 2024 pipeline review. And there's no drastic change in that split in the new version, I can say this much. There was 98 vaccine candidates, and when I say vaccine, there's actually within those 2 prophylactic monoclonal antibodies using 12 different technologies. And so we see that about 42% of the pipeline are vaccine candidates addressing diseases for which no vaccines have been registered before. And the rest are aiming to further develop vaccines or find new approaches to target a disease. And so that can increase, that can be increasing the breadth of coverage by increasing the number of strains the vaccine protects against, expanding use to a new population, improving formulation, or developing combo vaccines, for example. A few examples out of the 2024 pipeline. These are some of the targets, new targets that are addressed by our members, and some of the targets for which there are already registered vaccines, but where further development is ongoing. And of course, here we only address phase 1 to 3 clinical trials, but there's, of course, post-marketing studies ongoing on a lot of those vaccines. And so in preparation for this meeting, and also in discussions we've had over the past couple years with various stakeholders in the ecosystem, we see that Europe's vaccine evidence readiness, there are several requirements and there are some challenges. And I'm not going to go in detail because I think a lot of this was addressed in the previous panel. A lot of those messages came through. I heard Peter addressing real-time availability of data as being a challenge. We know vaccination status of vaccine brands is an issue as well. That there are certain issues with funding as well, but we see also that uptake level can have an impact on estimates, and that overall one of the key challenges in Europe is the fragmentation of our ecosystem. But I think it can also be an opportunity because we've heard before, and I think again this was Peter saying, that in some Nordic countries there's really good data systems. Why don't we learn from them and try to implement this example broadly in Europe? And I think this is the beauty of having a heterogeneous ecosystem, is that you have different ways of doing things in different parts of Europe. And if you can learn from that and implement best practices, then you can learn. Something that's really at the heart of immunization programs and vaccine development is this shared public health goal of infectious disease prevention. And I think it's easy, when you're in such an interconnected ecosystem to see what divides us rather than seeing what we have in common, right? And that's something we saw through public-private partnership projects, and IMI promised we had a lot of discussion on that to build alignment with the different partners. Because indeed, it's a very complex ecosystem, it's very interconnected, and so you cannot run effectiveness studies without interacting with, public health institutes or sites that work with public health institutes. And we know that working in silo for post-marketing surveillance, it really weakens study output, it impacts feasibility, it limits the comparability of data, it dilutes investment both in terms of funding, but also expertise. And that's at a time when there are really a lot of constraints on resources. And it can also have a decrease in vaccine confidence in industry, also by extension its products, and that can impact vaccination programs. So what works? As I mentioned, I was involved in IMI Promise and Rescue before that, but before those projects, there's many other IMI projects focused on vaccines that set the stage for the work we did on RSV later on. Advance, of course, was mentioned a lot today as establishing the blueprint that VAC4EU has been built upon. Drive was also a really interesting project, bringing together, industry and public partners to try to assess if robust influenza vaccine effectiveness estimates could be generated. And we've learned from all these. And what we've seen is that in certain areas, it was challenging to collaborate. So I put Promise on the slide here, but this 2.5-year project, which was at the very end of IMI, and was an extension of Rescue, was also tasked in preparing the European ecosystem for RSV immunization. And one of the things we wanted to work on was RSV surveillance, but also preparing for post-marketing effectiveness and safety studies. And it took us, I think, between a year and a half to agree on rules of collaboration within an IMI project that was already co-funded on what we could work on together, when we could be, as industry, involved in the conversation, when we had to step out of the room, where we could provide input and how. And we agreed between public and private partners on ways of working, on governance, on transparency through publication of the protocols, the comments. Everything was logged, but it took us more than a year to agree on this. And this was only possible after a 5-year project with the same partners where we had built trust. So that tells you how difficult this can be. But I'm hopeful, and I think, VAC4EU is demonstrating that can be used, that those learnings can be used. I also want to mention Become, which is an initiative standing for Beyond COVID-19 Monitoring Excellence, which was created in 2022 as a multi-stakeholder scientific forum on pharmacovigilance and pharmacoepidemiology. And this group actually published recommendations. I know some of you in the room were involved in this. And I'm mentioning that paper, of course, Heather, and Vincent, I think, is also in the room. And we presented this as Vaccines Europe. We presented the learnings from this to the EMA Industry Standing Group a few months ago. And the decision was to further discuss this with the Emergency Task Force. So I think this tells you that I think as long as we continue engaging and we learn from those experiences, we can, I think, build concretely, pragmatically, and find solutions for the future. So to finish off and open to the next speaker. So of course, scientific excellence is key, and we heard this morning how much the current context is making this even more important. It's really important to support evidence-based decision, but real science, not pretend science, right? And I think this takes a lot of experts in the room to agree on. Clear and consistent communication across stakeholders is paramount to safeguard public trust. We heard that a lot. Recognizing the expertise and experience of each stakeholder and work collaboratively, that's a key learning from those public-private partnerships that also involved patient representatives. And improved data infrastructure, in particular digital vaccination registries, providing the right level of granularity and shared nomenclature. So a few learnings, nothing groundbreaking. I think we've heard this before, but at least that means we're aligned.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. So we have had multiple initiatives now, or perspectives actually, from ongoing initiatives. I'm very happy now to invite Maria Dutarte from the EUPATI, so that's the European Patient Academy and Transformation for Innovations. Yes, good. Therapeutic innovation. Yes, so the patients are very important. We heard that this morning. So I would really, am very much looking forward to your contribution here and your view on this.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here, and happy birthday from another proud child of IMI. We are also 5 years old as a former IMI project. We started our activity in 2012. I've heard from some people that one of the first meetings of EUPATI were actually in this building, so a historical moment. And also the European Patients Forum, a large umbrella organization representing over 80 patient organizations, had a key role in launching our activity. So we are a training academy and a multi-stakeholder non-profit organization today, formally established in the Netherlands. And we want to enhance patient involvement in research. And so we really believe in this collaboration between patients and researchers, and that benefits everyone involved, all the stakeholders involved. And the sort of mechanism for how we want to enhance patient involvement is information, education, and training. And that's where the academy word is really important for us. Our focus has been on the medicines R&D, the full life cycle of how medicines are developed. Here you can see the patient involvement roadmap that was developed in the early stages of EUPATI. We mapped out the entire life cycle of medicines and development, and also the different endpoints where patients can provide their insights. And this particular roadmap is still very much referred to and used in this space. So this full life cycle approach is really important for us, as we believe that patient involvement should be systematic and implemented as early as possible in the process. And we believe that patient involvement is enabled through education that also covers the full life cycle. So we have today materials and trainings that dig deep into each of these areas. And so we provide educational resources and hands-on training to patients, but not only to patients, also to researchers about how to meaningfully involve patients. So for my intervention today, the three main boxes here from the left are the most important. We have a toolbox of materials, which is an open source sort of Wikipedia of medicines R&D, and it's available in 14 languages today, accessed by over 8 million users worldwide. And that is really addressing the general public. And that is therefore also part of our mission to share reliable information on medicines development through this toolbox. Then we have a patient expert training program, which is a 14-month program that takes the learner through the entire life cycle and the roadmap that I just showed. The graduates are called EUPATI fellows, and they are patient experts from different disease areas. And today we have over 500 EUPATI fellows. And then we have the so-called stakeholder education through our learning lab, which is these workshops for people like you, researchers, but also people from industry, about what it means to meaningfully involve patients throughout the process. So why am I standing here today? It's because we are at EUPATI now expanding our scope to areas like medical devices, digital health, but now also most recently we are exploring the vaccines area. We do enter this new space, so I'm also really humbled to be here today, as all of the discussions are really new to me in this space. And we address this area with the full life cycle approach. We are also interested in real-world data, real-world evidence, and what is the patient role in this area. And why is this area also important to us is that we see that patients have an interest, particularly the risk groups, people living with chronic illnesses, and those with limited treatment options, of course. And we see some promises there, of course, that involving citizens and patients can reduce vaccine hesitancy. We've heard about this today through increased awareness and vaccine literacy, but also then once they are involved in the development of vaccines, enhance their relevance and effectiveness. This is what we base our interest in. And we see that access to information and education play a key role, which is of course then aligned with our mission and vision. And I'm very happy that we today have this partnership with VAC4EU. I forced Daniel to shake my hand in front of the photo booth at lunch, also to, we want to celebrate this collaboration as we are learning from each other's worlds. And as one of the collaborative activities, we organized together with Vaccines Europe and also the Active Citizenship Network, also represented here today, a workshop last June. It was organized within the framework of the so-called Patient Engagement Open Forum, which is actually a sustainability action of another IMI project called Paradigm. So it's all about IMI here today. And this workshop was a sort of an exploration and collaboration. We were discussing the vaccine life cycle. We talked about the different stakeholders involved and also the concrete activities that civil society organizations and patient organizations can undertake to support vaccines campaigns and research. And so we had different groups in the workshop looking at the different stakeholder groups and their role in this process, their needs, but also what can we do together to enhance the cross-stakeholder collaboration. And to give you some input, I wanted to capture some of the findings from the group that really focused on the citizen and patient organizations. And many of these things have been already discussed today, but just maybe a reminder, a helpful reminder, that citizen and patient organizations can be those who also channel and provide the relevant information that is important for their communities. They can represent their communities. There are community leaders that can be helpful, and also they can advocate for science. And I think we have heard that many times today. But what do these groups need? There's this need to identify ambassadors, of course, and these community champions. The capacity building piece is, of course, very close to my heart as a training organization, and it should be tailored. It should be contextually driven to ensure also the representation. Access to real-world evidence is, of course, important to build trust and counter this misinformation. So we were discussing a lot about the needs of the citizen and community groups as well. And together we can then build bridges between researchers and citizen and patient communities, and I'm therefore also happy to be here today to emphasize that. Again, the identifying the key players in different communities. This is also a good example from the EUPATI patient expert training program, is that is a very demanding program, and it's not for everyone. But there are these leaders of patient communities that choose to spend that time, invest their time to study, and so that they can also teach others and make sure that there is involvement when relevant from their communities. And of course, then how can we strengthen the cross-stakeholder collaboration is to understand each other's worlds and each other's language. I've heard from many patient experts who have taken our program is that now they can finally speak the researcher language, that they can also translate their insights into a language that relates to a researcher's world, and vice versa. We hope there also to be a dialogue. And so, last but not least, I received this question for all of, I think it was for all of us. What should VAC4EU focus on from now on? And I would encourage there to be inclusion of patient preferences as part of the data collection, and then be part of these efforts to enhance information training, awareness building for citizen and patient groups. even in the sort of study design phase. I know we are not there yet, and I think this was mentioned by Peter earlier. There is very little patient involvement today in real-world evidence. But I hope that one day we will also have a pool of patients who are well-informed and trained, who can then take part of in the study design, and these studies can be truly co-designed. And then, of course, what we are already doing here is enhancing the multi-stakeholder collaboration that I'm a big believer in, as I have the IMI spirit in my DNA. So these are my key messages, and hope to continue the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria, for your contribution. I would like to move on to Laura Cornelissen. We heard already that the ecosystem at the moment, although we work together, there is still fragmentation in Europe, unfortunately. It's very difficult to keep the public health organizations engaged in the community and to work with vaccine manufacturers, for example, or to have a communication. This is what we witness. We have multiple initiatives and ecosystems such as ID Drive, which is also an IMI follow-up initiative, but we also have the VBIS platform led by ECDC that is doing vaccine effectiveness. And we have VAC4EU and probably many more, but it's still not completely connected. Now, I'm very happy that Laura is here. She is from Sciensano. She's a medical doctor working at Sciensano, who is a VAC4EU member, as well as RVM. But she is not just working at Sciensano, she is also a NITEC member in Belgium, and she is the representative of Belgium at ECDC. So we would really like to hear your perspective, Laura.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction and this kind invitation. I do feel a bit intimidated here, not just because I have never done an IMI project, which seems to be rare, but also because I was asked to give the public health perspective. And I think it's a pretty daunting task, and I'm not sure that there's one public health perspective, let alone that I can represent it. But what I can do is talk to you about the experience and the perspective from the Belgian Public Health Institute, which is where I work. So what do we want? I think when in our daily work, we don't do that much vaccine safety monitoring, because that's Jean-Michel and his colleagues at our medicines agency, but we really want data on vaccination coverage. And we had this beautiful example during COVID, where we had this dashboard and you could follow it in real time. It was super exciting. You could pick the bar you wanted to root for and then see how the green processed. We also had the data linked to contact tracing, so we could do effectiveness studies, not just on severe disease, but also on the risk of transmission. But that was COVID. And we learned that we want local data, because as much as we are globalized currently, policymakers, and especially politicians, seem to be much better convinced by data that this Belgian EU will do, but preferably it's really data from Belgium itself. And that might maybe sound a little bit provincial or stupid, but I think there are also good reasons for it, because health systems do differ, demographics differ, populations differ, there's different genetics. So it's fair enough, I guess, to want really local data. We want data that is independent. And when I put this on the slide, I really didn't think twice about it. It seemed obvious to me. But now that I've heard all the other speakers saying how important public-private partnerships are, I realize how much this is treading on thin ice. Yet I stand by the point, because as much as we do need collaboration, I think we cannot deny what is happening in, for instance, the US, and how perceived conflicts of interest were quoted as the reason to oust half of ACIP members. And so this is not necessarily me saying that we need independent data. It's the European Commission that really established a platform specifically to do industry-independent studies. And I think we need collaborations, but at least in terms of perception and in the current climate, it might also be really important to have some independent studies and estimates coming out. Timely data, for sure. I think most of the speakers have said it. Peter alluded to it in his introduction. I think there's a debate on what is timely data. I showed you the COVID dashboard earlier. When we tried stopping to update it on weekends after like 1.5 years of pandemic, when we were really quite tired of working weekends, because although it's mostly automated, someone needs to manually check it. We faced a lot of backlash. We really had to defend our point that it was not useful to update it on the weekends. No big decisions were going to be taken, and no big changes were going to appear anyhow. But it seems that once people are hooked on real-time data, it's hard to convince them of anything else. And so as much as I agree on timely data, not everything needs to be real-time. So we can have a discussion on what timely actually means. Of course, it needs to be high quality. That seems obvious, but it's not so easy. We know that primary care data, healthcare, I mean, I was a clinician. When we write our notes, we don't do it for national statistics to be extracted from it. We do it for ourselves and for our colleagues who need to look after this patient next. So there's a lot of work there to be done, which for sure all the VAC4EU members know very well. And it's about the data even being available. When we wanted to look at coverage in healthcare workers, we realized we actually don't have a source for this, because the only thing we could find was all the people that had a diploma that were aggregated to work as a healthcare worker. Now, I'm a gynecologist by training, so my vaccination coverage, vaccination status went into the coverage estimate of gynecologists, whereas I haven't seen a patient in the past 6 years, so it was probably not my coverage they really wanted to know. It needs to be detailed data. You can have vaccine coverage estimates, and then they go, yeah, sure, but what's the vaccine coverage in people with risk factors? And it becomes a whole other debate and task to tease out these subgroups. So how can we do it? This is how we did it during COVID. For the first time, we had a national vaccination registry. It was compulsory for the vaccines to be registered there, which was easy to do because the only way you could get vaccines was through the central procurement of the government. So it was easy to link it with an obligation to register it. This is currently not the case. You might also know that Belgium has quite a complex political structure. And so although I think everyone was pretty convinced of how well this worked, it was then decided that actually vaccination is a regional competency, so we're not going to have one national registry, but we will have 3 separate, and then we can start talking about how to integrate it, etc. So currently, yeah, we're at this stage of trying to, or not we, the different governments are trying to roll out the different registries, and I'm being told that the integration of the data to get national data would be for 2028, which seems incredibly far away still. For COVID, which we don't have for other diseases, we had really good lab testing. Well, we had comprehensive monitoring of the lab testing results, etc. So we could do a lot of linkages, and then we periodically linked it with additional sources that were less timely. Reimbursement data is typically complete after 2 or 3 years, because you can still submit your claims after even 2 or 3 years. So, how do we get there? Local data, that's clear enough. We need to use Belgian data sources, but then we need to make sure that they're there. I mentioned the example of the vaccine registries. but it even goes beyond that. In Brussels, where you're currently sitting, it's only in the past few months that the well baby clinics, which are one of the primary vaccinators, that they actually have computers. Previously, they would still write down the vaccinations in the paper records, and they would put stickers on another paper to reorder and refill their stocks. So I'm really happy to say that this is now in the past, but again, it was a big challenge to convince the nurses who've always been working in this well baby clinics to actually change. And in the south of Belgium, there is even some spots where there's no, where there wasn't any 4G network, and so the software ran into issues in the offline mode, etc. So yeah, we're not there yet. If we want independent data, then we need to have sufficient funding. There is, as I mentioned, the VMP, Vaccine Monitoring Platform initiative that received quite a lot of funding from the European Commission, and there's a lot of, as of now, ECDC again issued a tender. I think post-COVID, for those working in public health institutes, it's been a bit easier to secure sufficient funding because the need for strong surveillance suddenly had been proven quite clearly. If we want timely data, it really needs to be automated data extraction, otherwise we won't get there. But again, there's challenges there. We need to have the primary databases, and if we want to have sufficient detail, then we will only be able to get that through linkage. But this linkage, again, comes with lots of issues. One side is the technical part, where there's different technical standards, and FHIR and CMER, and different technical specifications. But the big issue is really about privacy and GDPR. And I actually had to step out of this meeting during lunchtime because we're doing a risk assessment on Mpox. There's Clade 1b in Europe, as you might have heard. And I was arguing for better registration of the vaccinations because we had quite a big campaign in 2022. And this was actually met with a lot of criticism by all the clinicians on the call, who were like, no, we want anonymous vaccination because Mpox is it's an STI, and it tells something about your sexual behavior because it mostly affects MSMs. So if we're going to register this, then it really has issues for, it could stigmatize people, etc. So yeah, I think from our perspective, we obviously all want the data and we want it linked as well, as much as possible, etc. But I don't think that everyone is as convinced of the need of that and of on how to get there. Flanders just recently updated their legal framework, so they would be allowed to link their vaccination registry to other data sources. And they had quite a hard time getting it through Parliament. There was a lot of criticism on it, and they were really not so happy. They managed to get it through, but it was harder than expected. And this, of course, is also linked to the vaccine certificates that we had during COVID and all the adverse sentiments that caused. As I said, linkage is really important. I think everyone recognizes that. But if I see in my daily work how hard it is, I really think we have still a long way to go. And I was quite happy to see that this is not just my personal feeling and me not knowing how to navigate the system, but something that also the OECD flagged. Where they, I think, quite rightly said that there's a lot of potential, but a lot of work still to be done. And with that with all of that in mind, of course, there's the European health data space that is looming around the corner, and they really push for this secondary use of data. And probably most of you know more about it than I do. I just stole this slide from a webinar. But if you look at what they want, the user journey, it's great. Like, you want to have it's all kinds of data. It's electronic health records, reimbursement data, biobanks, but even socioeconomic determinants. So it applies to really across the spectrum, which I think as a researcher we can only be happy about. There's one central application. Then they say, okay, it comes at a cost. You need to pay for cost. And I think there it already starts to get really complicated, because what does it mean to pay for cost? I showed you that we had really nice surveillance for COVID-19 vaccines. And so we were, of course, also solicited by pharmaceutical companies, because we were putting out vaccine effectiveness estimates, but not brand-specific. And so they applied to us and were like, okay, we want brand-specific estimates, and we want all kinds of data. And since we had a procedure in place that allowed other researchers to ask access to data, we also needed to have this for the pharmaceutical companies. We really didn't have any arguments to refuse them. But it does raise questions, because at our Public Health Institute, we also have the OMCL, which is the National Control Laboratory that independently tests each batch of vaccines before it's released onto the market. And so they, for instance, they are really, really reluctant to, they are also Sciensano. And so if Sciensano is paid by vaccine manufacturers, it kind of puts them potentially in a difficult situation. Of course, it doesn't really, but again, it's a lot about perspective and narratives. So it was decided, okay, we have them pay for cost, so not for setting up the system, etc., but really just for the extra time it takes to prepare those pseudonymized data sets so that they can do the analysis. And so our colleagues were filling in timesheets so that they knew how much to charge the pharmaceutical companies. But even there's an opportunity cost, because this was COVID times. I mean, you remember, everyone was super busy. We had probably other research questions that we wanted to investigate first that were not about brand-specific vaccine effectiveness, because anyhow, you didn't have a free choice in Belgium. And even though we were paid for this work to be done, that doesn't immediately translate in additional manpower. Like, you need time. You're not going to recruit another person immediately, and especially not if it's like maybe a week time. So pay for cost might sound simple. I really don't think that it is that simple in reality. And I think my baseline is that the European health data space is coming. I honestly think it's going to be marvelous, but the timeline is pretty ambitious. It's been officially approved, so implementation is going to start soon. And from my perspective, in any case, there is currently a very big gap between what needs to be and what currently is. And I'm not so sure how we will actually be able to bridge that gap. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura, for your perspective from the public health in Belgium. We go to our last panelist, not the least, Jean-Michel Dogné. He is a full professor at the University of Namur. He's also dean, and I understood actually that we have a very similar background, being both PharmDs and working in the medical faculty. You are very distinct in a way that you advise a lot the regulatory agencies and have been assessing many of the dossiers. So I'm very curious to hear your perspective on what we should be focusing on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. Happy birthday, of course. Indeed, as a regulator, I speak last. There will be also Peter Arlett. I guess it is just to make sure everybody else has said something we will have to regulate later. I could otherwise have said that it's not a coincidence, this is risk management. So, yes, indeed, over the past years, I have acted, and still today, as PRAC rapporteur at the European Medicine Agency for several vaccines, including the one that nobody wants to name, and more recently also the ICCIC referral, which is the chikungunya vaccine, for which you know that there have been different conclusion at EU level compared also with the FDA. So both of which have demonstrated how complex and dynamic vaccine evaluation has become, particularly in balancing evidence generating before and after marketing authorization, especially as it was said today in a complex media and political environment. And indeed, as part of the regulatory process and rapporteur at the level of the PRAC, like others who spoke this morning, I wanted also to share a bit of my experience during the COVID and how, to me, it changed really the way we do vaccine safety assessment. And indeed, I find myself in many ways right in the eye of the storm, being one of the unaware rapporteur of a series of vaccines. And earlier on, and Xavier Kurz is in the room, we work with Xavier Kurz to better prepare this pandemic and this COVID-19 vaccine discussion on how to best be prepared. And we used to work a bit together with Xavier Kurz. We used sometimes to run together at Canary Wharf at the European Medicine Agency in London. And we did maybe anticipate how we needed to run together to get prepared for this COVID pandemic. And the only indeed lesson learned was discussed a bit this morning, was the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, which at the end of the day did bring some interesting tools that we had to improve for the signal detection method, rapid detection method, for exchange, prioritization of information and assessment. But at that time, we did not have too much active surveillance system. And this is why and where we basically use quite rapidly the interest of having access to the so-called access program. And we'll see that this was a major concern since you know that these vaccines have been developing for the more rapid of the one in less than 1 year. And the preparedness was understood to be really the key to address all the safety issue. And we were quite confident then working on a database, working on safety signal, mainly from spontaneous reporting and preparing for observed to expected analysis using background incidence rate would be quite helpful indeed to address the key safety issue in a timely manner. And indeed, what we did was to update what we usually do in routine for routine activities, to transform them into additional activities, and especially in terms of preparedness with the different stakeholders, mainly the applicant, to update the risk management plan to have indeed a core risk management plan for the COVID-19 vaccines, and with a list of adverse events of special interest that was also discussed as part of the access program to estimate the background incidence rate, on top of traceability question and follow-up questionnaire. And we were quite ambitious also to have summary of safety data in a short period of time for a monthly report rather than usually 6 months PSUR reports. And the key question was also how will we address the question of the post-authorization safety studies? Meaning what kind of database will we use, how the industry will also work either together or with some specific European infrastructure that could be in place, and this was the case back at that time for the access program, but now we have seen that more than ever it was indeed needed. And finally, as I have said, the management of the safety signals was to us a key issue, how to tackle the spontaneous reporting that we knew would overwhelm the system. And I must say that now, more than 5 years after, the most frustrating part of the job was how to deal with the post-authorization safety study. I think we lost a lot of time to assess some studies that were requested to the marketing authorization holder or the applicant, depending on the timing, while we knew that they would not deliver that much in a short period of time. And so it means that as regulators, as rapporteur, as members also of the team working at the level of the EMEA, we were really busy working on how to use the best methodology, how to use the best database to and how to assess a protocol for which they had many differences in terms of applicants and in terms of adverse event that would be followed. So it was clear already back at that time that even if we had good template protocol, that we needed to have a more robust working environment, and of course, especially with VAC4EU and also at EU level for the regulators for Darwin. And why? Because at the end of the day, it was a bit tackled this morning, but when you are dealing with all the cases, most of the safety signals emerged from spontaneous reporting, and for which we were overwhelmed. And nearly all key regulatory decisions were based on these reports, often triggered by the most dramatic cases, TTS, VIT, that was the synonym, capillary leak syndrome, even GBS and myocarditis, even if they were also later put on the spot based also on pharmacoepi evidence. Spontaneous report triggered the decision-making back at that time. So it was a bit challenging to understand and to see how indeed what we did not anticipate, that still spontaneous report would trigger the decision-making, even in the absence of real-world evidence that would allow us to estimate not only some good absolute risk, but also some relative risks. And indeed, we therefore mainly relied on observed to expected analysis when data were available, and we know that for TTS you can expect what is expected in the list of adverse events of special interest, but when you have a new clinical entity for which by definition you will not have background incidence rate, you need first to come with new definition, but also therefore to have the database and the access to database to estimate the background incidence rate, and so of course that was the main difficulty. And when we look today at Europe evolving evidence ecosystem, we now have indeed key infrastructure that we know will fundamentally shape the future of this assessments and preparedness. So VAC4EU and mainly for the regulator, Darwin for EU. I must say there is not a PRAC meeting where we anticipate if a signal will be also addressed within this kind of network. Either if you are working for the pharmaceutical industry, for which you might be asked to have a post-authorization safety study outside of an initial risk management plan, but within then an updated risk management plan or a signal detection process. So this is now how we do, this is really the business that we do, and so we believe that any of these networks, VAC4EU and Darwin for EU at EMEA level, are not competing. They are complementary, they are serving different but connected functions in the real-world evidence chain. And I have cited one of them, the background incidence rate for vaccine before their launch is not only EU concern for preparedness. We have heard also during this panel that for the Mosquirix, for instance, we had this exactly with GSK, exactly the same question when we will use a vaccine in a region for which we do not have good background incidence rate. Some are also discussed by CEP where you will use some vaccines. So depending on how and if they will be assessed also at the level of the EMEA, this will be requested as a regulators as post-authorization safety study before the vaccine is launched. And so this exercise, and this is why I think VAC4EU has a long-standing existence in front of it, this exercise should be reproduced each year. We believe that the epidemiology, of course, of the disease is changed, especially since COVID, and we have now also new tools that would allow to have more precise estimate of this background incidence rate, adequately stratified, of course, and so this should be reproduced each year, even if with new adverse events that would emerge. So this is, of course, one of the future of this kind of consortium. And when a signal arises, whatever the source, but in a short period of time, as I have said during the COVID-19, these were mainly driven by spontaneous reporting, as for instance the TTS. I think this is where we have the key objective to me of VAC4EU and other networks is to provide protocols and studies for which we can have results, and the main difficulty is in the short period of time. This is where the improvement is surely needed as well, since this will allow us to embed quantitative benefit risk assessment into regulatory decision making. And why timing to deliver is key. All of you and some of us will remind some discussion Since politics did not weight regulators and promises of real-world evidence study results available, at best in 2 or 3 months, at best, when you vaccine nearly 3% of your population every week. They want answer rapidly and they want to take decision rapidly. And so that's the main difficulty that we had, and it led indeed to some countries to withdraw some vaccination, and depending on the data that you had from estimate that mainly came from spontaneous reporting, you estimate that the cutoff was an age group or a gender group, so it was quite different. Another example is when vaccines are authorized primarily on immunogenicity data, as was the case for IXCHIQ, we need, therefore, as well, robust post-authorization studies to estimate not only the risk, as we do with post-authorization safety study, but usually when it comes from immunogenicity data, the power of this study is really more limited than post-authorization safety study are even more important. But we need also post-authorization efficacy study or effectiveness studies. And this is why we had struggled when we had to reconsider the benefit risk of IXCHIQ vaccines to confirm if the benefit risk remained positive when we do not have clinical evidence of the efficacy or the effectiveness, especially with limited usage of the vaccine. So there is today more than ever a lot in terms not only on post-authorization safety study, but also on post-authorization efficacy study. And you know that the commitment and the decision-making from the regulators is therefore up to the obligation from the industry to perform these studies. And this is where, indeed, I believe that VAC4EU play a crucial role. Is in practical terms, this means that these stakeholders can conduct EMEA-aligned post-marketing studies using the methodological standard that regulatory trust, but within a neutral, independent environment that guarantee also scientific credibility. I believe also that VAC4EU should continue to provide capability for prospective primary data collection. We have also discussed with that this morning, especially particularly during the early phase of the vaccine rollout. On top of spontaneous reporting, this primary data collection on vaccine is really key for not only the regulators, but also for the public health authority within weeks, usually after the vaccination, rather than within months. To me, another key area where VAC4EU should continue to play an instrumental role is vaccine safety in a specific population. You know that back also with the COVID-19, we had usually, and it was discussed this morning, the key question, what do we do with pregnant women? What do we do with immunocompromised population? And in the NITAC, I'm also part of the NITAC, we decide that this group should be a priority. And in terms of public trust, it's quite difficult to explain how we do a priority of a group, especially with a new platform vaccine, for which you have no clue, not only on the efficacy, but also on the safety of the data in this immunocompromised and population, and for instance, a pregnant population. So there, of course, we knew and we know that if we had still a pandemic today, that we would have the same concern, but having some dedicated past studies with an environment that for which we have templates in terms of already available good protocol and with a network that now is working, I think we can shorten the time for which we might have the results. And on top, as mentioned also this morning, I think that VAC4EU has to continue on developing methodological tools and reflection to address causality assessment at population, but also individual level. And we have seen that only based on this spontaneous reporting, we had to take decisions during COVID period that changed the way the vaccine were used differently in different countries. What are the risk factors associated to the development of TTS in some specific population? Is it mainly males, female, younger adults? Therefore, I think that the risk factors should be addressed, especially when we have a specific signal for which we can have, using real-world evidence, quite rapidly more information. Developing the use of omics science in data collection is also, to me, a major orientation to be addressed, again, in the future of real-world data collection and assessment, especially for the causality assessments. And last but not least, based on this information, I think that every network, especially recognized network as VAC4EU, should play a major role in terms of education, and you have mentioned the educational part of VAC4EU, and also to contextualize the results to support communication in different countries, but also at EU level. To conclude, as someone deeply involved in regulatory science, I strongly believe that the success of European preparedness depends on how well we connect this system, Darwin EU, VAC4EU, European Health Data Space. We discuss also with the ECDC, the CEPI and WHO. I must say also that one of the main difficulties that we have when we did observe to expected analysis, when we had whatever the adverse event, was to have access to the patient exposure in a short period of time, stratified by age and gender. And there we had huge help from the NITAC and from the ECDC. And so if we do not have, I heard this morning, the denominator, some of the denominators include also the patient exposure, we need to connect to have this information. And I think we have learned a lot from that, so we need to connect. Why? Because we ensure that these real-world data, when transformed into real-world evidence, is both regulatory grade and publicly trusted, that it is how we build the confidence in the vaccine. You may have heard the famous saying, good, fast, or cheap, pick two. It reminds us that excellence, speed, and low cost rarely go hand in hand. If you want to have good evidence, if you want to have it fast, you need to put money on the table. And today, when it comes to collecting and analyzing data, whether primary or secondary, to address key questions of vaccine efficacy, safety, and use, we cannot compromise. We need both quality and rapidity, especially in an area of fake news, misinformation, and political challenges that question more than ever the trust in the vaccine. That's why I think that innovative initiatives such as VAC4EU are also essential to deliver reliable, timely evidence that trust informs public health. They must be adequately and sustainably funded. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. That was quite a good research agenda for VAC4EU, I think. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all the panelists for their perspectives that they've provided. We now know where they are coming from, and I have prepared some questions that I would like to discuss with you. So the topic of today of this afternoon is, where should we focus on? We have already some core statements there, but if I look at the themes, one of it is, how can we connect the dots even further? So there are global needs that Rebecca was talking about. There is an immunization agenda from WHO. There's the CEPI mission. There is, in Europe, various initiatives such as HERA from ECDC, the vaccine monitoring platform with EMA, the European Health Data Space. And I'm wondering, maybe just to start with you, Rebecca, if in CEPI's 100-day mission, it really will introduce vaccines rapidly, what could VAC4EU do in the global landscape to support that when these vaccines become ready, there is also readiness on the post-marketing data collection or the real-world data collection?
I hope this is on. So thank you for this very difficult question, actually. Because one thing that I didn't really make clear perhaps in my presentation, and I'll just be blunt about it right now. I mean, sitting in Europe, talking about the achievements of VAC4EU and looking to what should we do next is an incredible privilege. Yeah. Because the reality on the ground in a lot of countries throughout the world, as we have saw from COVID-19, simply do not have the capacity to generate local evidence of effectiveness or safety on their own vaccines and that are used on their populations. And they have traditionally also been excluded from clinical development programs. So they're really operating in a position of reliance entirely on evidence generated in high-income countries. We started to see this change a lot over the last couple of years, I'm very happy to say, with a lot of the efforts of the WHO in regulatory strengthening, particularly in Africa. We're seeing the beginnings of the formation of the African Medicines Agency. And I'm privileged to sit as a technical consultant on what is the beginnings of a PRAC for the AMA, for the now I believe I can say that the African Medicines Agency does exist, it's not future. And I'm beginning to see the beginnings of them working out their processes for a pharmacovigilance risk assessment committee and how they will ask countries and companies to meet regulations, be in a position to request marketing authorization holders to actually do these studies. And I guess what I would say is right now, particularly in Africa, I'm speaking particularly from that context because CEPI is very global. I have particularly focused on a number of the countries in Africa, particularly the BRAVE project, as you can see. So I want to comment that, of course, across lower and middle income countries, there's quite a diversity in the availability of infrastructure and expertise. So I'm talking from the African context. But I think one of the things that I might consider for VAC4EU is maybe there are lessons learned from a lot of the other initiatives. So the AMA is what's the word I want to use? Is looking to the EMA, right? I think that the EMA has done an amazing job in their good pharmacovigilance practice, in their sharing of their processes for a collaborative arrangement. And we see the AMA looking to the EMA for setting up much of the processes that they have. We also saw during COVID-19 Gates-funded initiative to bring countries together to review their spontaneous reports for COVID-19, called the AU3S project. So a number of African countries pooled their data and actually did statistical screening of the data and signal detection and signal assessment. And this was really with the support of the MHRA, but also the EMA and also with the US FDA. So I see that partnership, mentorship with real-world data, building those infrastructures, implementing those methods is something that is very possible. I guess a question is when, to be honest, because again, really just pooling data and reviewing spontaneous reports happened during COVID-19 on the African continent. And then a question relating to when, I might ask, is we often hear that for a lot of countries that are undergoing these large jumps, a question that I would have is, do the African countries in particular, or even other lower and middle income settings, do they need to follow the same path that we did in the high income countries? Or are there areas where they can kind of leapfrog? So what will be the role of artificial intelligence potentially? Can they figure out how to mobilize that without having to go through some of these very less this period of maybe not recognizing heterogeneity, right? I mean, they might be able to leapfrog into that AI space. So I guess in short, maybe my key messages are, I think Europe is an incredibly privileged position. I think it's been an amazing journey for VAC4EU. I look forward to VAC4EU being potentially in a role to offer that level of partnership and mentorship to a number of global areas that will be ready to take the next step, because I see that they are very much ready to make they are very much on the growth curve, almost in an exponential way, at least when it comes to vaccine safety.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That brings me immediately actually to Niklas, if I may, because both of you are funding agencies. So the question then becomes, of course, IHI is for making Europe great again, I think, or competitive, let's call it this way. Painful, sentence, let's call it this way. No, so IHI is very much trying to build competitiveness in Europe again for for the medtech and the pharmaceutical companies. It's one of the goals, not the only one. How much does IHI see like the co-development of what EMA is now doing in other parts of the world as parts of its realm to potentially fund as development area? Given that many of the vaccines will be utilized, and I'm coming to the IXCHIQ, will be used in continents where those diseases are endemic and data need to be collected in those continents. So I think my question would be, is IHI considering, or could it consider funding readiness on a more global level than just Europe alone?
It's a long question. So I don't think I would use the slogan "Make Europe Great Again," but so I think that was the takeaway from Rebecca's talk. I mean, global need rapidly becomes Europe's concern, and I think we've seen that in quite a few cases. So I think there are good reasons. On a practical level, so as a funding program, we do three things. It's about developing innovation for unmet public health needs, and it's about making sure that those innovation gets deployed in healthcare. And the third objective is to help make Europe's health industries globally competitive. So that's the starting point. We can, essentially any organization anywhere in the world can participate in an IHI program. There are restrictions on funding. That's the same restrictions that we have in the rest of Horizon Europe. So it's EU, it's the countries associated to the Horizon Europe program, and it's a number of low and middle income countries that are eligible for funding. The question is, are we an effective funder in that global space? So we have been involved in the past doing things like the Ebola vaccine. I think we funded both the vaccine development work on manufacturing, work on rollout, and even vaccination campaigns and trust in Africa. I think that was very difficult, and I think one of the learnings is that there are better partners for doing that piece of work than perhaps IHI. We have a sister partnership, Global Health, EDCTP3. They do things that is very difficult for us to do. So we running clinical trials in Africa and building African clinical trial networks, something they are set up to do, we are not set up to do. Working with European industry to develop some solutions are things that we are set up to do and they find very difficult. And so I think the solution here is to link together and not compete in the funding space. And we've had really good discussions with CEPI earlier this year on how to align. I think that's the starting point. There is too much work and there is no need for funders to compete. And we have really good examples, not in the vaccines, but in the tuberculosis AMR space of projects that have been starting in Europe, gone through EDCTP3, because indeed tuberculosis is much more widespread in Africa for phase 1, phase 2 trials, are now back in IHI projects for phase 2B, phase 2C. And the big question is, of course, where do we find the funding for a phase 3 trials should this be successful? And I think that's very similar to the 100-day challenge. Where do you find the syndication of funders that are able to take on that level of complexity?
Thank you very much, Niklas. So let me move to another topic, which is also something we heard a lot, and that is speed and timeliness and timely delivery and timely data. So speed was we had a warp speed development program actually in the US, which was a term utilized. And Maria, from your perspective, from the citizens' perspective, like how is it perceived if a vaccine becomes available speedy, and what can we do better in terms of communication that trust is maintained?
Thank you. And now I'm also wearing a different hat. EUPATI is not yet so active in this space. But as I understand from the patient organizations that I work with, there's this dual perception of speed, either acting quickly, responsibly, or then rushing irresponsibly. And And I don't think speed itself is the issue. It's how speed is then combined with transparency. And when it's well managed, also through the communications, speed can be framed as timely vigilance, and it's then safe and considered as such. And I think it also, when it's linked to the right values, such as competence, so that system really works, you can rely on it, you can trust. Integrity, so that there are no hidden motives, and there's transparency about the need, and then the care for people's well-being and the societal goals, and finally, of course, openness, acknowledging also uncertainties, as we heard today, sharing those openly.
Very much, and maybe then, Charlotte, how is industry looking at it, or Vaccine Europe? So how can you combine speed and not erode trust, actually, from patients and citizens?
Thank you, Miriam. And I think it's just as much a question for many of us around the table. But as industry, I have to say I completely agree with Maria. I think, acceleration doesn't necessarily mean taking shortcuts. That, of course, this has to be done responsively, and it has to be done in a smarter, more connected way. That it requires, of course, early, frequent engagement with regulators. And I think during COVID-19, that's one of the key lessons is there was a lot of exchanges on the topic of COVID vaccines and how to make sure they are assessed properly. Of course, I think a lot of energy was spent on building those connections and establishing, those fora for exchanges, but they brought tremendous value for people. I'm convinced of that. And I think, again, we all have the same goal. And all of that relies on trust. Trust in the evidence generated, but trust also in the products. Because again, this is another sentence that we say a lot, but vaccines don't save lives, vaccination does. And until people choose to be vaccinated, well, nothing can happen. And I think this is really about choice, about people having, as said by Emily earlier, having enough information that they feel they can make informed decisions about their own health. This is critical. And I think behind that trust, there needs to be scientific excellence, transparency. And, I think on this topic, sometimes we may have different perspectives of what it means to be transparent. I truly believe that it's about communicating not only about the results, but about the process, right? And saying, this is how the protocol was defined, this is how the clinical endpoints were defined, etc. And I think involving patients, for example, is a way to make sure this is inclusive. And this is why also collaboration and public-private partnerships are so important.
Thank you very much. I'm cautious of the time, but I do want to have a follow-up question, which is really about the data and data accessibility. And Laura, you alluded to the European health data space. And I think, Jean-Michel, you also said timely data. It's really important in Darwin EU, it's there. Now, my concern as a pharmacoepidemiologist is that, and I'm trying to build in the Netherlands, which is as dramatic as Belgium, in terms of research infrastructure, the health research infrastructure on a national level that then connects to the European health data space. Now, when we study all those regulations and the recommendations and the guidance documents that are coming out, there's a lot about making data available, but very little about, who should actually transform that data into evidence. So my concern is in this area of misinformation, are we going to what are your criteria? What would you like to request from those transforming the data in the EHDS into evidence? I don't know who wants to go first, Laura or Jean-Michel. From a regulatory, let's first take the
From a
regulatory
regulatory point of view, I think that this was why I was insisting on having not only templates, but also conducts that we have with NCEPT, how we do studies, how we interpret studies, and then how we, after publication, how we communicate on these studies, not over-communicating, for instance. I would just quote Peter Arlett, who is there, and you know that he will say the same, and he said that if we do not jump into it, others will do. And this is even more difficult when there is a publication, whatever the journal, to afterwards come with a letter to the editor to complain about the methodology when it is published, because it will already be in the media. And just last week, we have a lot of communication about this. COVID-19 vaccine increased the risk of cancer based on a study in South Korea. And we took a lot of time to assess the data. We identified really lack of many methodological issues and so on. And so I think it will be impossible if we have a system that allows to have access to the data, that everybody have access to the data and try to block that access. Because I think this is exactly the opposite of the interest now of the EU. Everybody can have access to the data. But how then afterwards it should be validated in terms of quality and use, I think there are two major responsibilities. The one is for the editors of the journals that need there to use conduct that are endorsed by either learned societies or VAC4EU and so on. And so that if you want to publish something, at least people that do pharmacoepi study using this data need to do like that. If not, it's too late when it is published, even if it's retracted afterwards. And secondly, also for the regulatory agencies, both at national and international level, we should use the same regulatory tools as well to also, when we have post-authorization safety study proposed and then the results are available to be used, whatever the source, since the methodology and how the template and the conduct will be followed would be accepted. And this is, I think, to me, the best way, and not to try to identify who should access to the data, because we will lose there.
Okay, so you don't want to block access, but you want to have control mechanisms for publication and...
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, and education, good.
Yes.
Laura, what's your perspective?
Yeah, so I think blocking access, as Jean-Michel said, is it? Okay. Is impossible. It's exactly the contrary of what the whole concept is. But I think the risk is real, and we heard this morning in VAC4EU you have the process where you go back to the data providers and you ask them, like, is this okay? Do you agree with this? And the point was made about how important it is to know your farmers, and I couldn't agree more. I often see this when we have interns coming to do some analysis, and then they just go like, "Oh no, but it's like that in the code book," and you're like, "Yeah, but this is real world data, so it might be like that in the code book, but this result is just not possible. So we might have to think about where it can come from." But of course, if now anyone can just apply for the data and it's a catalog and you have all this nice metadata, etc., I think it's brilliant in an ideal world, but in the real world, data is much more messy, and it will be really hard to then, if you have no idea where it comes from, to then interpret it correctly. So indeed, I think what Jean-Michel said is we need to be proactive. We need to beat them to it, which is, of course, impossible because, as I also just said in my talk, the fact that people then now need to access these data, it will require time from me, and pay at cost, etc. It will not offset everything, but we need to think hard of what are the questions that we want answers to, what are the things that we want to survey, and try and get those analyses out there first, and indeed build up sufficient trust that we have this expertise, that if we say something like this, it's probably grounded in solid research, etc. And so that it's maybe harder to contradict, or that if just whoever puts something on a preprint server, it might not have the same value.
Thank you. Any of the other panel members who would like to talk to this point?
Just I want to add something on that, is that we had exactly the same fears back to 2012 when we had in the law the obligation from each member state to have the possibility to have the patient reporting, especially when it was anonymous. We fear that we might have some difficulties to assess also some data that come from the patient, even anonymously. And then at the end of the day, now we are around 15 years after, I think we know that we can deal with it because we have also integrated that into a general assessment of the data. And I think that this is what is really needed to do. Will we assess or will we review the data differently if it comes from different stakeholders that would use the data? To me, the really important is the methodology that we need to deserve and that we need to use to provide the results.
Thank you. Is there any additional comments before we turn to the room?
If I may, yeah, I think it's working. So a couple of things. I think we're talking partly about an anti-science agenda here, and which is growing very strong. And I think what we need to realize, at least from my perspective, I think is good science isn't the solution or the answer to the anti-science agenda. It's the platform on which we start to build the answer. And so, but the way to mitigate the anti-science is possibly quite different from the way we are doing studies in science. And it might have to do with community engagement. It is the way we reach out to different communities, how we include different communities in the science and in the broader society. So there might be completely different answers, but the platform on which to develop those answers is good science. I think the other thing for me is, if you look at European health data space, I think one thing that will change quite dramatically is it will separate data access from evidence generation from decision making. And traditionally, those three things have been quite linked. You have had access to data, you generated the evidence, and you did that because you needed to do a decision. With the European health data space, those things will be completely separated. And I think that's a big transition that we need to learn how to manage. Now, I didn't know about this other example of the anonymous data, but I think that's a great example, and we probably have a lot to learn from there. So that's just two reflections from me.
Rebecca, yeah.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm taking off my CEPI hat here, please. This is more my previous role as a regulator and just vaccine safety person now. But I think this gives me an opportunity to maybe link some things together. A comment that I wanted to make, and maybe it relates a little bit to the patients and having them more involved in the questions answered, which could impact people trying to get data. Maybe there's a lot of people trying to get data because they want to answer questions that they haven't felt were addressed. And I'm thinking in particular of a lesson learned from COVID for me that I really witnessed was, a lot of the questions, a lot of the safety concerns that the public had were non-serious events that really didn't impact the benefit-risk profile. So we're not really the priority of regulatory authorities. And I'm thinking particularly of menstrual disorders and even tinnitus. And I remember that it was very interesting to watch, at least in the United States, some anthropology academics in the United States, really noticing an impact on the menstrual cycle. And they just, set into motion their own study, really using social media. And it took a while for it really to be recognized by the regulatory authorities that this was something that the public wanted answered. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know enough to know how many access to data and analyzing them could be related to that. But I think thinking again about what questions we're asking of the data and getting patients' input, or in this case, just healthy people, their input on what questions that they want answered, because sometimes I don't think that they always align with the questions regulatory authorities or maybe even public health authorities answer.
Thank you, Rebecca.
I definitely agree with that. I think to build on Niklas' point and Rebecca's, right? So we have data, evidence, then decision-making for policymakers, but then you also have individual decision-making, right? To get immunized. And I think this is where we have maybe the biggest gap that was highlighted by COVID, because there was this break in communication, this break in trust. And I think you're very right to mention this, this example. I think we also, probably all of us were following the COVID vaccine development and then implementation very quickly. And it was very clear for all of us involved that, you know, those vaccines were tested in clinical trials against severe disease and hospitalization. But that wasn't clear to the public when it was rolled out. I think there was, in terms of communication, a lot of, you know, shortcuts or lack of clarity. And this is also why I think, you know, aligned communication, consistency is very, very important. And also talking about health literacy, right, Maria? Explaining, and this is in peacetime, by the way, explaining how real science works, right? It takes time. It's about formulating hypotheses, designing experiments, collating the data, analyzing the data. And I think, you know, we need to do more for the public to understand that, because many people mentioned the US situation happening right now. This is very worrisome, not only for vaccines, for science in general, and I think we really need to raise awareness of what science is.
Thank you, Charlotte. Maria, shortly, because I want to go to the public as well.
Very briefly. Yeah. So listening to all these interventions, I've been thinking of the concept informed trust and what that means. And also happy that we are today discussing the European health data space, as I see that there is enormous need for information and training also among citizens and patient groups. Some of this work has already been started by the European Patients Forum, for example, that's driving an initiative called Data Saves Lives. I'm very jealous of that name of the project. I think it's wonderful. And I think we have to continue in a dialogue in order to continue building that informed trust. And every one of us, I think, has their role to play in implementing the European health data space and benefiting from it as well.
Thank you. So we're back to collaboration amongst partners. Good. So I think that makes it a circle. Are there questions in the room? Patrick and Taylor? Oh, you have online. Patrick first, you are live, so we...
Okay. Happy to be on live. Just maybe a naive question. So I would always stand up against authoritarian regime, but we have seen that 42% of persons who were vaccinated regret to have been vaccinated. And then we are talking about clear information and to let people decide if they want to be vaccinated or not. So if we have to face polio, measles, and not exclusively COVID, how will we reach a sufficient level of vaccination in the population if we go that way? You know, to be efficient regarding the vaccination, you have to reach, what, more than 80% of the population to be vaccinated. So, so the question is how to handle that, how to face the situation where 42% regret to be vaccinated and we leave the possibility of patients to refuse to be vaccinated.
Thank you, Patrick. Who would like to address this or answer this?
So I'm not going to answer in the name of industry. I'm going to answer in my own name. I think, you know, we saw during COVID that there was a top-down approach, that there was, in some cases, right, mandatory or heavily incentivized choice. And I think short-term gain can have a long-term impact that's very negative. And I think we broke trust during that era. I met people who, when I tell them I work in vaccine development, they tell me, never again. I was forced to get vaccinated during COVID. This was someone in Italy, and I could feel really fear in that person. And I think this is impacting the rest of their life, their loved ones, people they talk to. So the ripple effect is massive, right? So I personally don't believe that you can force people into these types of choices. I think everyone said today during the different discussions that trust is at the heart of vaccination, and I really truly believe in that. So it's about rebuilding that trust, being consistent, clear messages, and I think raising health literacy so people can make the right decision as we scientists understand it. So this is my take.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for your personal perspective, which I totally relate to. Rebecca, can you keep it short?
Yeah. I was just going to say that I heard an analogy, which I like very much, that, when an airplane tragedy occurs, the next day, everybody really goes and gets on an airplane again. And the reason that they do is because they trust that there will be an investigation to find out what went wrong. They're very clear about that. The black box we follow when it's going to be found, we follow the story. When vaccines injuries happen, this has not really been the case. And I think that has eroded trust over time. So I think humility, admitting that we could have made mistakes, and really investing in understanding vaccine injury will make confidence in vaccines and may make it so that people don't regret or whatever. I mean, I think we have to win that trust.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. So it comes back again that what our focus should be in the coming period is both continuing collaborating, connecting dots, ensuring we are speedy, and we build trust further. I think that is a nice way for our strategy meeting tomorrow. Yes, Taylor, go ahead.
Thank you, Miriam. This is just a comment from Maribel Celas online. She says, I agree to have access to data, but it should be a committee to review/approve protocols. A bad study is not good for science and is not good for stakeholders.
Thank you. Is there anybody who would like to comment? It's obvious. Jean-Michel, yes.
I think either we believe in the system that we, by full transparency, have access to the data, and afterwards people do what they want to do after the data, but if it is published, if it is therefore, even if it's not published in the scientific journal, then it's up to our job to comment on that and to be public on that. And it was said that during the COVID, many of us were heard and tried to explain. And I must say that this is not new. We have the worst that we can have today regarding the safety of the vaccine. Access, full access, somewhere to ultra-vigilance VG-base about the data. So it means that we have only the numerators. They do not have the denominator, they do not have any causal association, and everybody have access to that full. So it's quite easy, even today, to take the information of any vaccines, to take by suck whatever they have an information and say, look what the vaccine can do. And we know that the full access does not lead today to other thing than information that comes in the social media, but not as publication. And secondly, I would say that not only this access allows anybody to see what's happening, but it allows the authorities to have trust in terms of transparency. And this is what we did with COVID. We published the full risk management plan. Now we do that at the level of the EMEA for the other medicine as well. The EPA are published in detail. We have access to raw data. Let's suppose we do not propose that. This would be worst. So I think that we should see it as transparency will lead to trust and not the other way around.
Thank you. I think I
have one last question from Heather. Would that be okay?
I'm fine. You keep the time, right?
Yeah, okay. Last question.
So I really appreciate the points that you've made and the points about trust. I really appreciate the transparency of EMA around the risk management plans and the data in that space. I think that's where we ought to be. My concern is still that we're not translating that concretely to patients, right? We're talking amongst ourselves about this, and we do this great work, but it still is outside of the realm of the world of our mothers, right? And there are mothers, they know what we're doing, theoretically, right? They still, so how could VAC4EU work to better inform the people that are the linchpins to the patients? And in my brain, that's their medical providers, right? I think that you could do a random poll of MDs and nurses out there, and they don't know what the systems of pharmacovigilance are, with maybe the French doctors being a bit of an exception because that model is really different and interesting. But how can we get the work that we do socialized into the people that are having the conversations with the folks whose trust we want to build? And can we use VAC4EU in that model?
Thank you, Heather, for that question. Jean-Michel, you...
Yes, yesterday I had a conference for pharmacists and any patient on the vaccine safety. I think we should repeat. Explain by who. I'm a regulator, but I also a community pharmacist and professor, but every day I repeat the same to the same kind of population using the same day language. And so I think we should have everybody on board. And when you see the study about trust and confidence in the vaccine, who are the first to be trusted? Healthcare professional, nurse, pharmacist, and physicians. And I think they need also to take that really into account, to not spare their time, to explain really what is needed to be explained. And I would agree to disagree with you on how the EMEA at least published different things. Of course, they published the full risk management plan, the full EPA. But if you open the website of the EMEA, you have also in lay language for any new medicine, any new information in lay language, how the product is to be used, not the patient information leaflet, in lay language. And I also use that also to educate healthcare professionals that they can have the information on trusted websites rather than having an untrusted website where they have the information. So I think everybody needs to be part of the journey. And not only any regulators or the VAC4EU. What I said, VAC4EU should really also provide information for the communication, because even for healthcare professionals that are not specialists in pharmacoepidemiology, I can tell you that when you explain some bias, you need to have a good explanation in terms of communication to better take it into account, showing that the conclusion need to be mitigated. And this is why I believe that there we need also to improve.
Thank you very much. I think we need to wrap up, given that Daniel is here. I would really like to thank the panelists for their perspective on where we should focus on. Thank you for bringing that to us. It's a lot that VAC4EU could do. My last question had been, like, if you would come to the 10th year anniversary, what would you like to see? I guess I know now, by now, we should communicate much better. Probably see what we can do with our colleagues in the rest of the world and how we can provide our lessons learned. And we need to get more speedy. So I'm looking at all the programmers here and those that need to change the data into evidence. There is a lot to be done. So thanks a lot, everybody. I think now it's a break, Daniel, and you are going to give chocolates? Or?
Exactly. So we have after... Thank you very much. Big applause to a wonderful panel.